started off as essentially a pushback against a fuel tax, essentially Macron trying to balance, you could say, the cost of climate change, of trying to do something about some kind of environmental policy on the backs of the French citizens. What started off as essentially a pushback against that has become an all-arching movement against the government of France itself. Fuel tax is not enough. They've extracted concessions out of Macron, and they are continuing to protest. Gilets jaunes, the Yellow Vest movement, has gone into the 9th week of protesting against the Macron government. And not just 9th week of protest. The media was saying as if these guys were running out of steam. They weren't running out of steam. It was just Christmas. They are continuing, you could say, the movement. They've expanded their wants, or you could say their list of concerns, or their list of demands, so let's say it that way, to Macron himself. And to have a greater say-so, not necessarily direct democracy, but a greater say-so within regards to using referendums in the government. They are looking for a larger hand in the governmental system itself. I love this. So I've made no hedge that this show, me specifically, has been pretty enamored with what's been taking place from the standpoint of Yellow Vest, because I think that's necessary. You have a citizenry that gets to the point, and this isn't political parties, this is the citizenry itself. Just regular human beings, just like you and I, who go about their day, who say, we're sick of this. What is taking place in the political apparatus itself is not working in our best interests. And we have this odd quirk of believing that it should work in the best interest of the citizenry. The idea that you're going to give massive tax cuts while they're trying to balance the economic devastations and the economic woes that are going to befall us on our backs is a deal breaker. And the fact that you were willing to do it in the first place is a deal breaker from us in the standpoint of having you as the government. We want your head. And we want your head for the things that you've done, not necessarily because of some, weird esoteric thing of who you are. I love this, because I look at what's taking place in the United States and this idea of wanting things without having an organized demand for those things that is not being appropriated by the political parties themselves. Meaning the movement itself has resisted being appropriated by the political parties. And from the left and to the right and all across the political divide, these guys are out there pushing for change. They're doing God's work. There may be some aspects of violence in it, meaning people setting stuff on fire, pushing things over, but the overwhelming, overarching majority of the people who are out there are doing so in a peaceful manner, in a peaceful protest. They're doing God's work. I still say, if the United States, if people really want some fundamental change in the United States, you may want to look to France as some indication on how to get that change. Because think of the things that are dealing with in the United States: crumbling infrastructure, water in some cases that's not clean and has lead running through it all throughout the country. You have California and Washington State, where you have homeless villages of people in the richest country on the planet not able to find decent living standards. You have several cities in the United States where people who live in the area has been priced out of their ability to live in their own cities. That's not just the United States, that's all across the world. Lisbon, London, similar phenomena. I guess I'm making a point that with the difficulties, especially economic, just because you have a high level of employment or a low unemployment rate doesn't necessarily mean that the people who are working those jobs are secure. The idea of security within a job, the idea of being less vulnerable in a society, for somehow gets passed to the side for a high stock market and for this number of low unemployment. That doesn't necessarily get across what it means to be alive, and whether or not people who are in situations that are vulnerable within the country itself, those people are going to have angst, those people are going to be pissed off. We're shocked as shit that people are dying from overdoses. We're shocked as shit that people are having these kind of nervous breaks. You're in a society that makes things difficult. Now, how do you want to express that energy? You can express it in Trump, you can express it in Sanders, but if you're getting into the mainstream media of sorts, one party is talking about Russians. The other party is talking about immigrants. Both political parties are trying to put off the problems that befall the United States on somebody else as opposed to dealing with the issues themselves within the United States. You can imagine that that would piss people off, that the main issues and the main things that they're affected by and they're bothered by are not being espoused in the media landscape and not even in the political landscape. France's response to this was the Yellow Vests. They're doing God's work. Now, in pursuit of doing God's work, you can imagine that given a demand, power is not necessarily going to concede or accede to those demands. And in this case, they've put out the police force in order to bash and beat and to put tear gas and to try to disperse the crowds that have peacefully gathered to protest. 84,000 people showed up for the 9th week of protests throughout France. 80,000 police was deployed as a show of force all across France. Essentially almost one policeman for every protester. I'm curious on how long they can keep that up. On the 9th week, 10th week, 11th week, the French government having to essentially borrow in order to pay these policemen to be out there in order to bash people who have common interests. The overwhelming majority of the French population still supports the Yellow Vest movement and does so in pretty high regard. I think it started off at like 70% and they're still around 60%. Meaning those police, as they go out and beat and spray tear gas on those protesters, there has to be some acknowledgement that the protester is working for the benefit of that cop who is beating the devil out that protester, because that cop is just like or has more in common with those protesters than it does with anybody else, despite having the job of bashing and dispersing those protesters. It's a weird dialectic of sorts. Let's take a look at the story, because I have two stories on this. But the first one deals with the violence that has essentially been thrusted upon these, for all intents and purposes. I mean, the overwhelming majority, there's always some level of violence in any protest that you're dealing with, but the overwhelming majority of the people who are there non-violently. It didn't stop the cops from cracking heads. This is utter chaos. Complete and utter chaos. So, there's several parts of the story that are interesting, and then I'm going to go to the next one. Gilets jaunes protesters engaged in a 9th week of protests all over France on Saturday as President Emmanuel Macron prepared to give his political future in an open letter to the French people in national debate. The officials say that at least 84,000 demonstrators turned out across France, thousands more than last week. They thought that they were done. No, it was just the Christmas holiday. We wanted to be with our family. But now, in the new year, let's continue this to push what we're trying to accomplish. With 8,000 of those in Paris, where protesters passed without serious incident. Gilets jaunes, named after the yellow vest French motorists, right? After the violence of previous weeks, police put on a show of strength, deploying 80,000 police officers nationwide and about 7,000 in Paris. Police forces used tear gas and water cannons against Gilets jaunes at the Arc de Triomphe. In Bourges, I think that's called, a town of 66,000 people, chosen because of its central location, about 6,700 Gilets jaunes gathered despite the ban on protests in a historical center. That is amazing, and I love that. Meaning, the government says, you're not allowed to do your protests here. And they do it anyway. I mean, the whole point of the protest is to get across concerns that you have in this kind of open and overt way with the hopes of bringing people onto your side while simultaneously putting pressure on the governmental apparatus. They are doing this, flouting the laws of the government itself. In a sense, you could say, to put pressure on the government itself. The police, ideally, being that these guys are breaking the law, should have arrested 6,700 people. They did not do that. They didn't have the means by which to do that. Let's keep going. There were 4,500 Gilets Jaunes demonstrators at Bordeaux and 5,500 in Toulouse. I don't pronounce it wrong, I'm sorry, according to officials. Police said that 156 people were arrested in Paris, 108 of whom remained in custody. Nationwide, 244 people were arrested. If 6,700 people were breaking the law and you were able to get account of the fact that there were 6,700 people completely flouting the law, how were there only 244 people arrested? Right? Am I wrong on that? Essentially, the French police can't fully contain what has been taking place. Meaning the French state doesn't have the capacity to essentially process all of these people in this way. Despite the show of force by the police, there is no way that this police department can be on over and over and over and over and over and over again, because these cops have to be paid in order to do this. Maybe they could. I'm pretty sure they can borrow a ton of money to do it. But are they going to do it? And the fact that 6,700 people has flouted the law in this particular place, and they've only arrested 244 people, that shows somewhat of a strain in their capacity to deal with this. Macron has been throwing stuff overboard left and right to try to, let's say, take the sting out of what has essentially racked his government and came out of nowhere. I still say they are doing God's work. I love the fact that they are not necessarily ideologically fully bent in one way or the other. That this is some of the mass movement of people who are just saying, enough, enough, we're done. We're done. Macron, and I'll lead into the next video on this. Macron is trying to have a national dialogue. This idea of trying to say, all right, I get you guys are pissed off, but what do you want? Because from his standpoint, his approval rating is in the 30%. Their approval rating is 60-70%. You can see some of a problem here right off the bat. You're also going to run into a problem from the standpoint of the movement, like other movements, meaning what's next. If you have an element of this movement that wants to push in one direction and another element that wants to push in the other, this is going to put pressure on the movement itself to make a choice on what it wants to be. Fact of the matter is, what it is now has certain advantages in that it's not necessarily ideologically bent one way or the other. And from my own perspective on this, going in the direction of violence would be a negative. You'd be surprised what people are willing to give up in order for order. And the idea of violence is going to freak people out, and you're going to lose support. The support is your major weapon in all of this. The protests, yes, but the protests are just there in order to get people, make a decide on whether or not they want to back you or not. And to put pressure on the government, especially with the show of support that you have at your disposal. But turning to violence is going to create somewhat of a dilemma in a population that doesn't want to be potentially on the receiving end of that violence. Even if they agree with your aims, they will be against you from the standpoint of any kind of level of hostilities. My suggestion would be to keep it non-violent. And I say this way. You can be castigated in a certain light when the movement becomes violent. I would strongly recommend against that. Even if you have just cause. Like and I think of this through the lens of the civil rights movement. Part of these guys wearing suits, holding signs saying, I am a man. Non-violent. Training, practicing non-violence in the face of people who are aggressive and hitting you and being violent to you. Because fact of the matter is, when that's shown on TV, it looks like one side is just holding a sign saying, I'm a man, and this other side is being completely obtuse and belligerent. That doesn't look well. Non-violence, to some degree, has gotten you this far. I say stick with it. Alright, I'm going to end this. I'm sorry I'm not keeping this one long, but I have another one that I want to put that's coming up after this. Yeah, I have another one immediately that I want to show after this. So, if you guys enjoy the content, please feel free to share, like, subscribe. You can always support PayPal or Patreon And stay with me because I have another video coming up in like 10 minutes, just long enough for me to flip, long enough for me to change the controls. Thanks all. I'll see you shortly.